It was late, and I was walking through the dense jungle on my way back to camp. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the last traces of light were disappearing. I had been hiking for hours, hoping to get back before it got completely dark, but I'd gotten turned around somewhere along the way. I wasn't panicked yet, but I knew I needed to find my bearings soon. My flashlight flickered. Great. It had been acting up all day. I slapped it, hoping to get it to work, but it only gave a weak beam. It would have to do. The jungle felt alive around me, the air thick with humidity, and the distant rustling of leaves seemed like it was coming from all directions. My boots crunched against the dry leaves underfoot. I kept moving, staying close to what I thought was the main trail, but everything around me started to feel off. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Then, I heard something. A soft, rustling sound, like footsteps. My heart skipped. I paused, listening. It was too regular to be an animal, and it was getting closer. My throat tightened. The sound was unmistakable now, soft and deliberate, like something walking, but not quite the way a person would. I quickly turned, scanning the dark shapes of the trees. At first, I saw nothing. But then I caught a glimpse of movement. My flashlight cut across the darkness, and for a split second, I saw eyes. It was too fast to make out the creature, but the eyes were unmistakable, yellow, wide, and staring straight at me. I froze. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The eyes blinked, and I heard another rustle, this time closer. Something was approaching me. That's when I saw it, just barely through the beam of my dying flashlight. A monkey. It wasn't the small kind you see in tourist brochures, but something far larger, standing unnaturally still against the dark backdrop of the trees. Its hands were too big, and its posture was wrong, almost too human-like. It tilted its head, almost like it was sizing me up. I stepped back, hoping to keep distance. My heartbeat thudded in my chest. This was no ordinary monkey. I'd heard about the larger primates in this region, creatures that didn't normally attack humans, but could become aggressive if threatened. Then it made its move. It lunged, fast as lightning, straight at me. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned and ran, heart racing. The jungle blurred around me, branches swiping at my face, roots trying to trip me up. The sound of the creature behind me was deafening, its feet slapping against the dirt, and its heavy breathing close enough that I could almost feel the air moving. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I broke through the trees and saw the soft lights of my camp in the distance. I didn't stop to look back, just kept pushing forward. The moment I reached the safety of the camp, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. My flashlight was barely working now, but I turned it on one last time, shining it toward the jungle's edge. There was nothing. Just the dark outline of the trees and the faint sounds of the night. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was an overactive imagination, maybe I had been tired, but the image of those eyes, those yellow, unblinking eyes, still lingered in my mind. The next morning, I found a deep imprint in the dirt near the camp, like something large had been standing there for a long time. But there were no tracks, no footprints, just the shape. I'll never know what it was, but I'm certain of one thing. I won't be going back into that jungle anytime soon. It was just after dusk when I found myself walking through the dense jungle, the air thick with humidity. The trail I was on had been quiet for the last hour, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I'd been hiking for most of the day, trying to clear my mind after a stressful week at work. The path ahead was narrow, and I could hear the faint sound of water flowing somewhere to the left. As I pressed on, I felt a strange unease creeping up on me. It wasn't the jungle itself, but something else. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it, a sudden, sharp noise from the trees above. My head snapped up. There, in the fading light, I saw something move quickly through the branches. My first instinct was to think it was a bird or maybe a squirrel, but then it happened again. The movement was too fast and deliberate for any animal. I knew. I stopped in my tracks. The air felt colder now, and the silence seemed too heavy. My heart started pounding in my chest. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, but I was alone. The rustling above me continued. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, probably a monkey. After all, I had seen some during my hike, swinging through the trees, laughing and screeching in the distance. I moved forward cautiously, my eyes darting to the trees above. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like I was being watched. And then, suddenly, I heard it, laughter. Not the playful kind I'd heard earlier in the day, but something darker, more guttural. It sent a chill through me. I froze, every muscle tensed. The sound was closer now, almost directly above me. I looked up. A small shadow darted across the canopy, and for the briefest moment, I saw its face. It wasn't a regular monkey. Its eyes were wide and unnaturally dark, almost human-like, but filled with something sinister. It was watching me. My throat tightened. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't good. I started walking faster, trying to ignore the feeling that it was following me. The path ahead curved, and I pushed myself harder, trying to put distance between me and whatever that thing was. But then the laughter came again, this time from behind. It was closer now, more frantic. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a run, not daring to look back. The jungle seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on either side. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the bushes felt like it was right behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing near the river, my breath ragged, my legs burning. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The laughter had stopped, but I could still hear the faint rustling in the trees, too close for comfort. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the riverbank, my eyes frantically scanning the surroundings. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, but the sounds eventually faded. The jungle grew still again. I dared to take a deep breath, still shaken but relieved. Maybe I had just gotten too paranoid, I thought, the weight of my exhaustion starting to take over. I spent the night at the river, keeping a fire going, and when morning came, I made my way back to the trailhead. The hike back was quiet, the jungle nothing more than a peaceful backdrop to the sun's rise. When I returned to town, I spoke to a local guide about the trail. His face went pale when I mentioned the strange sounds I'd heard. He told me something that made my blood run cold. There are stories about the monkeys around here. They are not like the ones you think. They've been known to follow people. I didn't stay for more details. I just walked away, trying not to think about the eyes I'd seen, about how they never blinked. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing rustling outside my window. The laughter echoed in my head. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched never left. I'm not sure what I encountered in that jungle, but I'm certain of one thing, it wasn't a monkey. And if I ever go back there, I'll make sure I'm not alone. I'd been traveling for a few weeks through the dense forests of Southeast Asia, working on a photography project. I'd read about the area before coming, how it was full of monkeys, but not the kind you'd see in zoos. These were wild, aggressive creatures, used to people, but still unpredictable. I didn't think much of it until I found myself in a remote village where they were everywhere. The locals warned me about the monkeys. They said they'd snatch anything shiny or food-related, but I figured that was just an exaggeration. The first few days were calm. The monkeys would watch me from the treetops, or dart around the edges of the village, but nothing happened. I went out to take photos, setting up my equipment near a small river that ran through the forest. It was late in the afternoon when I saw one. It was alone, just sitting on a rock by the water. I had never seen a monkey up close before. This one was about the size of a grown man, with matted fur and sharp eyes that seemed too intelligent for comfort. I kept my distance, but as I slowly crept forward to take a photo, the monkey's gaze locked on mine. It didn't move, but there was something unsettling about the way it just stared at me. I kept my distance and took the photo, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I could feel its eyes on me even as I packed up to leave. That was when I heard the rustling behind me. I turned, expecting to see something else in the brush, maybe another monkey. But there was nothing. When I started walking back to the village, I felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, even though I hadn't seen anything. Every time I looked back, the forest seemed empty, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I was almost back at the village when I heard it again, rustling, but this time louder. I didn't turn around. I started walking faster, my heart thumping in my chest. Suddenly, there was a loud screeching sound, and I felt something brush past me. I froze. It was the monkey, and it wasn't alone. More of them had appeared from the trees, at least 5, maybe more. They were moving fast, silently, like shadows. I broke into a run. I'd been hiking for hours, just trying to clear my mind. The path was narrow, winding through thick trees and dense underbrush, and the air smelled earthy, heavy with the scent of damp leaves. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that made the woods feel more like a maze. But I wasn't worried. I'd done this trail before. I knew it well. But then, something felt off. There was a quiet sound, different from the usual rustling of animals or the wind. A soft scratching like something was moving through the branches. I stopped walking, listening. The forest seemed unnervingly still, too still. Then I saw it. A small monkey, its fur matted and dirty, crouched on a branch ahead of me. Its eyes locked onto mine. There was something about the way it stared, intense, focused. I figured it was just a wild animal, but then I noticed the way it moved, slow and deliberate. It wasn't running away, like most wild animals would do. No, it was watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me, like it knew I didn't belong here. I took a step back, instinctively reaching for my water bottle. I hadn't seen any monkeys on this trail before, and the feeling of being watched unsettled me. The air felt colder now, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. I turned around to keep walking, but then I heard the scratching again. This time it was closer. I turned my head slowly, and there it was again, perched on a lower branch, staring at me. My heart skipped. This wasn't normal. Monkeys weren't supposed to be out here in the woods. There were no known habitats for them in these parts. I felt a spike of panic rise in me, but I tried to stay calm, reminding myself to just get to the clearing ahead. I started walking faster, hoping to get some distance, but the monkey followed. It was moving between branches, always just ahead, keeping pace with me. It wasn't making any noise now, no chatter, no rustling. Just the soft scratching of claws on bark. Getting closer. I pushed myself harder, nearly jogging now. My breath was coming faster. The trail ahead should have been clear, but now it seemed to stretch on longer than it ever had. I glanced back, and the monkey was still there, keeping up, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. I needed to get out. Panic surged in me as I realized how alone I was. The woods were empty. No one was coming. I picked up my pace even more, my legs burning, my chest tight with fear. The monkey was still in the trees, keeping up with every step I took. Then, finally, I reached the clearing. I burst out into the open, where the sky was visible again. My breath was ragged, my hands shaking. The monkey stopped at the edge of the tree line, just staring at me from the shadows. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in this strange, silent standoff. Then, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. I stood there for a long time, catching my breath. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I didn't know why the monkey had followed me, or why it seemed so, intentional star. I'd been afraid for my life, but now that it was over, the tension drained from my body. I made my way back down the trail, my mind racing with questions, but as I passed the last bend, I looked back once more. No sign of the monkey. Just the quiet of the woods. I didn't see it again after that day. But sometimes, when I'm out hiking, I'll hear that faint, eerie scratching sound again, and I can't help but wonder, maybe it wasn't just a monkey out there. I had been living in the small village for about a year, working as a wildlife photographer. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked it, the isolation, the quiet mornings, the open space. There was one thing, though, that I couldn't quite get used to. The monkeys. It wasn't that they were particularly dangerous or aggressive, but they had this strange way of watching you, always lurking just out of sight. During the day, you'd hear them chattering, but as soon as it got dark, they disappeared into the jungle like shadows. I could never shake the feeling that they were always nearby, waiting. One evening, I decided to take a late walk down to the river. The sun had just set, and the air was cool, but still heavy with the humidity. I wanted to get a few pictures of the water at twilight, something that would look good in my portfolio. As I made my way down the narrow path, I could hear the faint rustling of leaves. It wasn't unusual, birds, maybe a small animal. But then the rustling grew louder, like something big was moving through the underbrush. I stopped, trying to see what it was. My heart started beating a little faster, as I realized I was completely alone. The village was miles away, and the jungle was dense here. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Complete silence. Then, without warning, something brushed against my leg. I jumped back, stumbling, my heart pounding. But it wasn't an animal, it was a branch. I looked down, relieved, but the relief didn't last long. I heard another noise. A branch snapping, closer this time. I turned around, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the trees and the thick undergrowth. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer, or a boar. But I couldn't help the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I turned back and kept walking, my camera at the ready. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick. And then I heard it again, a faint rustle in the bushes, followed by a low grunt. I froze. In the dim light, I saw movement, shapes, shifting between the trees. There was no mistaking it now. Eyes? Eyes glinting in the darkness, watching me. Not just one pair, dozens. Dozens of eyes. Panic surged through me. My breath caught in my chest. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I didn't know why. Maybe I was too terrified to move. Then they came, fast and silent. I felt the ground tremble as the monkeys appeared from the shadows, their dark forms darting between the trees. They didn't make a sound, except for the occasional hiss or grunt. My skin crawled as they closed in. I could hear their claws scratching against the bark, the rustling of leaves as they moved through the branches above me. I stumbled backward, camera still in hand, but I couldn't focus on anything. All I could hear was the sound of their feet, barely audible, but always there. Closing in. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a root. I fell hard onto the ground, scraping my palms against the dirt. The monkeys were closer now. I could hear their breathing, their chattering, like they were circling me. It wasn't an attack, not yet, but it felt like one was coming. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the path, every step heavy with dread. My heart raced as I glanced over my shoulder. They were following me, fast, but not quite close enough. I reached the clearing at the edge of the river, the moonlight spilling across the water. I knew I wasn't out of danger, but I kept running. My legs burned, my chest tightened, and my mind screamed at me to move faster. I could see the village lights in the distance. As I reached the edge of the village, the noise behind me stopped. I dared to glance back, expecting the worst. But there was nothing. No monkeys. No movement. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The air was still, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my house, locking the door behind me. I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Had I imagined it? Had it been my mind playing tricks on me? The monkeys weren't usually like that. They were curious, sometimes mischievous, but not like that. The next morning, I went back to the spot near the river, hoping to make sense of what had happened. I searched for tracks, broken branches, anything that might explain the panic I felt. But there was nothing. The path was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign of the monkeys. It was as if they had never been there at all. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. Maybe I'll never be sure if I was being hunted, or if it was all just my fear playing tricks on me. But one thing is certain, I don't walk those paths at night anymore. And I don't think I ever will again. Some things you can't unsee. Some things you can't forget. And whatever it was that followed me that night, I'm not sure it was done with me. It was late when I decided to take a walk through the park. I'd been working from home all day and needed to stretch my legs, so I figured a short stroll would clear my head. The park was always empty at night, just a few scattered benches and streetlights casting long shadows across the paths. I wasn't expecting anyone, but as I walked past the small jungle gym, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was a dog, maybe a stray. But when it moved, I froze. It wasn't a dog. It was a monkey. It was small, maybe a foot tall, with matted fur and dark eyes that seemed to gleam under the dim light. I stood there, confused, wondering how the hell a monkey had gotten loose. I mean, this wasn't a zoo, just a small neighborhood park. I thought it might be some kind of prank, but as I stepped closer, it didn't move. It just stared at me. Something about the way it looked at me made my skin crawl. Its eyes were wide, too wide, and its mouth hung open, like it was waiting for something, or worse, like it was watching me closely, sizing me up. I wasn't sure if it was sick or just hungry, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I slowly turned to leave, thinking that maybe I could just walk away and forget about it. But then I heard something behind me. A rustling sound, like something moving through the bushes. I glanced back. The monkey was gone. I kept walking, telling myself it was fine, just my imagination running wild. But the hairs on the back of my neck I never thought a small village could be so unsettling. I moved here for the quiet, away from the noise of the city, thinking it would be a peaceful life. But from the moment I arrived, things felt off. The village was tucked away in a valley, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed to change. The houses were old, and the streets were narrow and crooked. The people, though kind, always seemed to look at me a little too long when I walked past. At first, I told myself it was just because I was new. I noticed something strange about the village schedule. Every evening, just before sunset, the streets would empty out. No one was ever out after dark. I asked an older man once why that was, and he just gave me a vague answer about the village being safer at night if you stay inside. But when I asked why, his face went pale, and he quickly changed the subject. One night, I decided to stay up late. I wanted to see for myself what happened after dark. So, I sat by my window, watching the empty streets. At first, nothing happened. But as the moon climbed higher, I started hearing sounds, faint rustling, like footsteps on gravel. It wasn't normal. It was too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I pulled the curtain aside just a crack, and that's when I saw them. A group of people, all wearing dark, weathered clothes, walking down the road. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just moved slowly in a line. The strange thing was, their faces were obscured, not by masks, but by the way they hunched their heads, as though they didn't want to be seen. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, like they were headed for something. Or someone. I froze, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to go out and ask them what was going on, but a stronger part of me told me to stay inside. So, I watched from my window as they disappeared down the road, heading toward the old barn at the edge of the village. I knew the barn had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The place was falling apart, the roof caving in. Why would they be going there? The next day, I asked one of the villagers about the barn, and the look in her eyes made my stomach turn. She quickly dismissed it, saying it was a dangerous place, best left alone. But there was fear in her voice. The same kind of fear I had seen in the older man's face when I'd asked about the village's strange customs. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something dark happening in this village, something no one wanted to talk about. So, I decided to go to the barn myself. That evening, after sunset, I quietly slipped out of my house and made my way to the barn. It wasn't easy to get there, the path overgrown with weeds and brambles. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath again. I reached the barn just as the sky turned dark. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but pushed it open. Inside, the barn smelled of damp wood and old hay. I took a few steps inside, and that's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I followed the noise, heart pounding, and found a trapdoor hidden under a pile of hay. It had been carefully covered, like someone didn't want it to be found. I pulled it open. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were rows of old, wooden crates stacked against the walls, some of them cracked open. But it wasn't the crates that got to me, it was what was inside them. They weren't filled with old tools or forgotten possessions, but with jars filled with dark, thick liquid. And inside those jars were things that looked too human to be anything else, but too twisted to be real. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, but suddenly I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, and there they were, the people I had seen last night, standing in the doorway. Their faces were still hidden, but they weren't the ones I feared. It was what they were guarding. In that moment, I understood. The village wasn't cursed, not in any supernatural sense. It was controlled by something far worse, fear. The villagers had been hiding this secret for generations. The barn was a place where they kept their shame, their sins, whatever it was that they had been hiding from the outside world. And they would do anything to protect it. I didn't say a word. I knew there was nothing I could say. I backed away slowly, and when I reached the door, I ran. I didn't look back. The next morning, I packed my things and left the village, never to return. I never spoke to anyone about what I saw. In fact, I never spoke of it again to anyone, not even to my family. The village has remained a secret in my mind, a place I escaped from. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear the soft scraping sound, the sound of something being dragged across a floor. And I wonder if I truly escaped at all. Maybe, I think, I never left. Maybe that place is still waiting for me. The village I grew up in was small, isolated, tucked away in a valley that felt like it was always a few steps behind the rest of the world. The roads were narrow and dirt-covered, lined with old stone houses that seemed to sag under the weight of time. There was something about the place that always felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it for years. It wasn't that anything bad happened openly, but there was a quietness about the villagers, a way they kept to themselves, eyes a little too watchful, as though they were waiting for something to happen, but never really speaking about it. I was in my late teens when I started noticing the little things. There were always strange sounds at night, like someone walking around in the fields, or distant thumps from the woods. But when I asked anyone about it, they'd either change the subject or give a vague answer. Just the wind, they'd say. Or the forest can play tricks on your mind. But I wasn't stupid. It was something else, something more deliberate. It started with the lights. I'd be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I'd see a flicker of light through my window, coming from the woods behind our house. It wasn't the light of a car or a torch. It was steady, almost like a lantern, but it would move too. I'd lie there, frozen, watching it sway from side to side. And then it would stop, as if whoever was out there was aware of me watching. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But over the weeks, it kept happening, always the same time, around midnight. I'd wake up, see the light, and hear footsteps, soft and slow, crunching on the frost. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something, or someone, waiting for me to do something, to acknowledge it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a jacket and quietly left the house, walking toward the woods, heart pounding in my chest. The light was already there, bobbing through the trees like someone was walking just ahead of me. I followed it, keeping my distance, the dark forest closing in around me. It felt like the trees were watching too, their branches twisting in strange shapes, reaching down like they wanted to grab me. I kept moving until I reached a clearing, and that's when I saw it. There was a circle of stones, half covered with moss, and in the center, a fire burned low. No one was around. But there was something in the air, something heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The firelight danced on the edges of the clearing, flickering and shifting in ways it shouldn't. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned to leave, but then I saw something in the shadows, figures, standing still, their faces obscured by hoods. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were watching me. My heart raced as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of the village. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked the door behind me, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I couldn't understand what I'd seen, but I knew something was wrong. The village was hiding something. The next day, I decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore, the feeling of being trapped in a place that didn't feel safe, a place where people whispered and avoided your eyes. But as I packed my things, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of life on the streets, no one walking, no children playing, no animals around. The village felt empty, quieter than it ever had before. As I stepped outside, ready to leave for good, I saw one of the villagers, an old man who'd always been kind to me. He was standing by the gate, looking at me, his face pale. I stopped, waiting for him to speak, but instead, he just nodded slowly. "It's better that you go," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing here for you." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't need to. I understood. I left that day, never looking back. And as I walked away from the village, I realized that it wasn't just the forest or the strange lights that made it terrifying, it was the silence of it all. The way the village seemed to breathe around you, waiting. Waiting for something to happen. Waiting for you to see the truth. And in the end, the truth was that some places are cursed in ways you can never understand. I'm not sure what the villagers were hiding, but I know now that the valley was never meant to be home. Sometimes, I still hear the sound of footsteps in the dark. But when I turn, there's no one there. The watcher in the woods. I moved to the village of Wexley, a place so quiet it felt like time itself slowed down. I needed peace after years of city life, and this remote spot seemed perfect. The houses were spaced out, surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with